Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental Archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to another episode of the Waterloo podcast. This week we're taking the first look at a battery of the Royal Artillery, the Foot Artillery. The organisation at the time was to have various numbered battalions, each comprising 10 batteries. Now, I call them batteries out of habit and will refer to them as such in this episode, but strictly speaking the correct term should be companies. There should be 10 companies. Lloyd's unit being No.2 Company of the 10th Battalion. Each battery comprised 6 guns. At Waterloo, Lloyd's battery had 5 9-pounder cannon and 1 5.5-inch howitzer. Unlike the horse artillery that we looked at in episode 5, the foot artillery, as the name suggests, marched into battle, although their guns and wagons were pulled by a separate corps, the Royal Artillery Drivers. Let's begin, as always, by seeing where the men of the battery were from. There's birthplace data for 78% of the battery. As we can see here, that's 41% English, 21% Irish, 15 Scottish, 2 Welsh. It's interesting to note that the ratio is very different among the NCOs, with a disproportionate number of Scotsmen. 6 out of the 10 NCOs were Scottish, 3 Irishmen, and only 1 being English. I think we'll see that phenomena, a disproportionate number of Scotsmen promoted to bombardier, corporal, sergeant and so on, repeated throughout the Royal Artillery as a whole. In terms of counties, the only thing worth noting perhaps is that of the 21 Irishmen, 18 were from the counties that now comprise Northern Ireland, from places like Armagh, Fermanagh, Antrim and so on. In terms of experience, we can see the following dates of enlistment. We can see that 1808 has the highest intake of men, with 1813 and 1812 after that. So that means 60% of the battery had over 5 years' experience, and only one man, drummer William Kemp, had less than 2. The longest serving man in the battery was, perhaps unsurprisingly, its sergeant, William Mackenzie, from Quatre in Banffshire, who'd enlisted in 1798. The battery had not served in the peninsula, but had been part of the Walcheren campaign of 1809, and around half of the men in 1815 would have been present in that disastrous foray to the Netherlands, the aim being to capture the 2 ports of Antwerp and Flushing. In the end, the British Army suffered catastrophic losses, not from any fighting, of which there was practically none, but from the now infamous Walcheren fever, a kind of malarial-type illness which not only caused the deaths of thousands at the time, but left many men suffering recurrent bouts of the sickness for the rest of their lives. There were certainly such men in Lloyd's troop at Waterloo, as we'll hear later. A quick look at the 10th Battalion's history shows that Lloyd's was one of 3 companies which served in Walcheren, as you can see here. No. 4 Company saw quite a bit of action in the peninsula, but was not present in 1815, with the other companies being stationed in the Mediterranean, North America, Cape of Good Hope, and so on. So Lloyd's Company was the only one from all 10 companies of the 10th Battalion to take part in the Waterloo campaign. In 1815, the company comprised 101 all ranks, consisting of Major Lloyd, Second Captain Samuel Rudyard, 3 lieutenants, Phelps, Wells and Harvey, and then 1 sergeant, 2 corporals, 7 bombardiers, 2 drummers, and 84 gunners. In the 1815 campaign, it was paired with Cleves Battery of the King's German Legion, with both attached to the 3rd Division, that's Alton's division. Let's now join them then in Flanders. The batteries of Lloyd's and Cleves were among the few to make it to Quatre in time to take part in the battle. At the beginning of the day, 2 guns under Captain Rudyard had been detached to support the 69th Foot. He was ordered to reunite with Major Lloyd and the other 4 guns, and only just left the 69th when, looking back, he witnessed the devastating attack on his regiment by the French cuirassiers, the relatively green British infantry being caught out of square amidst the tall rye crops, and consequently decimated by the heavy French cavalry. On reaching the farm at Quatre, Rudyard observed that Cleves' battery had, as he put it, macadamised the road with the bodies of dead cuirassiers through an enfilading fire down the road. Doubtless already exhausted from their forced march from Brussels, Lloyd's battery was then immediately ordered into action to support the Brunswick Brigade, but soon received an extremely bloody nose from the French in response. Before the 6 guns of Lloyd's battery could even be detached from their limbers, they came under a withering fire from 2 French horse artillery batteries in the wood. Captain Samuel Rudyard describes what must have been a terrifying baptism of fire for most of the men present.
Colonel Kelly, Deputy Quartermaster General, ordered us to take up the position. We did this under heavy fire, and before we unlimbered, some 3 or 4 horses of each gun and wagon were killed, some wheels disabled, and literally some of our gunners were cut in 2. For we were not more than from 400 to 500 yards from the enemy's batteries.
Lieutenant Fortescue Wells, the most senior of the 3 lieutenants, observed the carnage.
Lloyd's battery suffered very severely. Many of its men and horses were killed and wounded. 2 of its guns could not be taken off the field till the action was over, so many horses being killed.
However, despite this initial setback, the remaining 4 guns managed to assert themselves over the opposing French and Captain Rudyard again.
We succeeded in silencing them, and also in obliging a solid mass of French infantry to retrograde and return to the wood. Finding ourselves now alone without any support, except a few lancers of the Brunswickers, and the duty executed that we were ordered upon, we limbered up and walked off towards the Quatre farm and joined our division.
After the battle, in the evening, Sir Augustus Fraser, one of the commanders of the British artillery, wrote,
2 of Lloyd's guns were dismounted and for a time lost. We have since regained and remounted them, and are procuring fresh horses to replace those which have been killed.
I believe the word dismounted here means the barrel of the gun was either knocked off the carriage on which it lay, or a wheel was destroyed. Overall, despite the initial devastation of guns, horses and wagons, Lloyd's men, along with Cleves' battery, seem to have played a key role in providing support to this section of the Allied line, which, as we've heard in the previous episodes about Kemp's brigade, often found themselves stranded as masses of French cavalry swarmed around the battlefield. The dispatch of the 24th of June from Sir George Wood, overall commander of the British artillery, emphasised the key impact the 2 batteries of foot artillery had made.
I beg you will be pleased to mention to his lordship the Master General the good conduct of that part of the artillery which was engaged on the 16th. They were warmly engaged, being several times charged by the French cavalry, and tended much to the success of the day.
The man described by Rudyard as being cut in 2 by French cannon fire was probably gunner Henry McPeak. While other men enlisted died of wounds in hospital or killed on the 18th of June, he is the only man listed as killed outright on the 16th of June. He was an Irishman from Magherafelt in Derry and was brother to Bombardier William McPeak, also of this battery. But actually that's not the end of Gunner McPeak's story, and we'll hear more about him later. During the night of the 16th, the men were still not allowed the sleep they must have craved, being up all night repairing broken wheels and axes, and only just got the work done in time to move off at dawn, joining the rest of Wellington's army in its retreat through Genappe, through the driving rain, and back to the position of Waterloo. There, still they were not allowed to rest, being placed with Cleves' battery by the sandpit near La Haye Saint farmhouse, and ordered into action once more. From this position they fired down the road towards the inn of La Belle Alliance in the distance, at the pursuing French columns, peppering this building with holes from their round shot. 2 French horse artillery batteries fired back, but had little effect. Eventually, at last, with the French deciding to halt their pursuit, Wellington ordered the Allied artillery to cease fire, and the muddy, blood-spattered artillerymen were at last able to lie down and try to sleep in the torrential rain. On Sunday, 18th of June, the men must have presented a sorry state as they prepared for the third consecutive day of fighting. The position in which the battery was placed can be seen here. Many thanks again to author Nick Lipscomb for kind permission to use his map of the Allied artillery line. This map is from his superb book Wellington Guns, which is highly recommended. While it can be quite complicated to keep track of the movements of some batteries throughout the day, it's nice and simple for Lloyd's company, who occupied this central position throughout the entire day and did not move. You can see it marked here with the letter M. The 6 guns, repaired as best as possible from the damage inflicted at Quatre, were placed here in the front line. The ammunition wagons with the horses and Royal Artillery drivers were in relative cover a little way back in a hollow between the road and the combined square of the 69th and 33rd Foot. Artificers' wagons, the forge cart and so on, were much further back in an artillery park far from the fighting in a wood to the rear. Ammunition was shuttled back and forth from this depot in the rear as required. However, just before the battle started, Sir Augustus Fraser, riding down the line of guns, found that, to his great frustration, the Prince of Orange had given orders for Lloyd's battery to move to a position guarding the intersection of the Parve and the Genappe Road. This left a dangerous hole in the line, which weakened the 3rd Division infantry behind it. Fraser cancelled the order, calling up Ross's troop of horse artillery from reserve to guard the intersection, and Lloyd's guns to remain in front of the South Lincolnshire and West Riding regiments. However, another mix-up also called for solutions from Fraser.
I acquainted Alton that Lloyd was not to be taken from him. Judge, however, of our surprise on learning that by some misapprehension of orders, Lloyd's ammunition wagons had been sent to the rear. And to be vexed was in vain. One wagon was borrowed from Sandham's battery, and an officer was sent to the rear for Lloyd's wagons.
So from this position, the battery fought all day long. They were subject at first to the massed French artillery bombardment. Captain Rudyard describes the scene.
The ground we occupied was much furrowed up by the recoil of our guns and the grazing of the shot, and many holes from the bursting of shells buried in the ground. As horses were killed or rendered unserviceable, the harness was removed and placed on the wagons or elsewhere. Our men's knapsacks were neatly packed on the front and rear of our limbers and wagons that they might do their work more easily. Every gun, every carriage, spokes carried from wheels, all were struck in many places. My own horse was shot through by a 9-pounder shot behind the saddle flap, and did not fall for some time.
Later in the day, as the massed French cavalry attacks began, it was necessary for the officers and men to run for cover, some hiding under the guns and wagons, some sprinting for sanctuary within the Allied infantry squares behind them. Rudyard describes the game of cat and mouse that went on throughout the afternoon and into the early evening.
The cuirassiers and cavalry might have charged through the battery as often as 6 or 7 times, driving us into the squares, under our guns, wagons, some defending themselves. In general, a squadron or 2 came up the slope on our immediate front, and on their moving off at the appearance of our cavalry charging, we took advantage to send destruction after them. And when advancing on our fire, I have seen 4 or 5 men and horses piled up upon each other like cards, the men not having even been displaced from the saddle. The effect of canister.
An anonymous account, published in the year after Waterloo, described an incident during these massed French cavalry attacks.
I cannot here resist relating an anecdote of Major Lloyd of the artillery, who, with another officer, whose name I could not know, was obliged to take refuge in our square at the time these charges were made, being unable to continue longer at their posts. There was a gun between our battalion and the Brunswickers which had been drawn back. This, Major Lloyd with his friend discharged 5 or 6 times at the French cavalry, alternately loading it and retiring to the square as circumstances required.
It was presumably during one of these cavalry attacks, or maybe during the final infantry assault of the French Guards, that Major Lloyd received his mortal wound. The only witness account we have is from Lieutenant Wells, who states the Major was wounded by an officer of the French Imperial Guard. In the evening of the battle, Augustus Fraser wrote to his wife,
"In this very house is poor Lloyd. Leg shot off, but not yet amputated."
It was perhaps this delay in amputation which led to infection, for gangrene set in, and William Lloyd died 11 days after Waterloo in Brussels. In reporting the death of Major Lloyd, Sir George Wood wrote,
I can, without hesitation, affirm that a braver or more zealous officer never entered a field of battle, and who did his duty on the 16th and 18th to the satisfaction of every general officer.
In terms of the other casualties, it's difficult to obtain accurate numbers of killed and wounded for the British artillery of this period. One of the few options is to check the musters for men listed as being in the General Hospital after the battle. This is not entirely reliable, as a man might merely have been taken ill, but with that caveat, we can see from the musters that Lloyd's battery seems to have suffered 29 casualties, more than double the number of the next most badly wounded Royal Artillery battery, and presumably reflective of the hard fighting at Quatre. Here then is a list of the men killed and wounded. 2 men listed as killed in action, 6 died of their wounds, and 21 listed in the General Hospital after the battle, so presumably wounded. For infantry and cavalry units, it's possible to double-check such men against other documents, but no such luck with the artillery. The Ordnance Department of the day had a tendency to do everything differently, including the manner and style in which they compile and kept their records, which tend to be disappointingly colourless in terms of human detail. For example, a lot of the gory but fascinating detail afforded us through discharge papers for infantry and cavalrymen does not exist for the artillery. On the printed discharge papers of the period, there's a space left blank to be filled in. This man is discharged in consequence of... The Royal Artillery clerks habitually wrote something as vague and unhelpful as unfit for further service, without providing any reason why that man was unfit. Indeed, often in the space where it says reason for pension, they will have written the amount, 6p per day, or whatever, rather than provide any reason at all. It's very frustrating. However, there is one man in the list above who we know for sure definitely was wounded, and that's Lieutenant William Harvey, whose right arm was amputated. He received a pension of £70 a year for this wound, and was appointed into an invalid battery in 1817. Among the men who lost their lives was gunner Henry McPeak, we've mentioned earlier, who was killed at Quatre, and likely the poor man cut in two by the devastating counter-cannon fire of the French horse artillery. We've mentioned already that he was from Magherafelt in Derry, and the brother of Bombardier William McPeak, also in this battery. Now, Henry's widow, Mary, aged 25 in 1815, was awarded an annuity by the Waterloo Compassionate Fund. She was listed as a seamstress living in Woolwich, the headquarters of the artillery regiments in the UK to this day. Now, interestingly, she is recorded as remarrying and becoming Mary McCafferty at St Mary Magdalene Church at Woolwich on the 12th of April 1818. And her new husband was gunner Patrick McCafferty of this battery from Drumholme, Donegal. After the battle, the company formed part of the Army of Occupation until March 1816, when it returned to England and marched home to Woolwich. There, in 1817, the company was disbanded, the same fate befalling the other companies at their various stations around the world, and that was the end of the 10th Battalion. As the regimental history puts it, it fell a victim to the reductions which economy rendered necessary, but which the artilleryman must always bitterly regret. Despite the disbandment of the battalion, this did not mean the discharge of all the men. They were merely transferred to other battalions. While the infantry and cavalry of the day were often desperate to reduce numbers after Waterloo, and keen therefore to cull large numbers of troops who were over age or under height or just plain unlucky, the artillery generally took the view that a trained man was a valuable commodity who needed to be retained for as long as possible. Now we know what became of 73 of the other ranks after Waterloo, and 34 of them, or 46%, were still serving 10 years after the battle. And an extraordinary 14 men out of those 73, nearly 20%, were still in the regiment 20 years after the battle, only being discharged in the late 1830s. Even repeated poor behaviour does not seem to have been sufficient reason for the artillery to let a man go. Gunner Thomas Jones from Abernant, Carnarvonshire, a little man of 5'2½", by 1830 seemed to have had enough of military life. After 18 years in the service, including 4 in the West Indies, he was imprisoned 5 times following court-martials between 1830 and his eventual discharge in 1836. Even then, his conduct is described as only indifferent, which seems fairly restrained, all things considered. Well, one of the last Waterloo men to still be serving in the British Army was Bombardier John Gillies. Born in Campbelltown, Argyllshire, he served in the Renfrewshire Militia before enlisting in the Royal Artillery in 1808. He was promoted to sergeant in 1825 and then sergeant major in 1842, serving for many years at the Royal Military Repository in Woolwich. This was a school for officers and men to be taught the science and practice of artillery. Incredibly, he was not discharged until 1854, so during the Crimean War, aged 69, and was presented with a gold watch by Major General Wynyates, another Waterloo man. He enjoyed just 4 years of retirement, dying in 1858, and was buried at Plumstead Churchyard, not far from the Woolwich School. His obituary claimed that he was the last Waterloo man in the artillery. What became of some of the other men of the company? Gunner Jeremiah Barker was discharged in 1819, still only 29, and returned to his native Bradford. One Saturday night in August 1823, he was walking through Ivegate in the town centre when he was set upon by 6 or 7 ruffians who knocked him down and dragged him 20 yards down the street. They then kicked him and robbed him of his money and his precious Waterloo medal. The medal was later recovered from a local watchmaker, where it had been bought for 4 shillings and 3p, for around £12 in modern money. The value of a Waterloo medal has gone up just a bit since then, a Royal Artillery medal selling a few years ago for £2,500. We heard earlier of the long-lasting effects of Walcheren fever contracted during the campaign of 1809. This finally claimed the life of Lieutenant Samuel Phelps, who survived the perils of Quatre and Waterloo, only to finally die of the disease in 1827, aged 37, and is buried in the churchyard at Rudbaxton in Pembrokeshire. Captain Rudyard was promoted to Major in 1830 and Lieutenant Colonel in 1837. In his career, he served all around the world at St. Helena, the Cape of Good Hope colony, Ceylon, India, and the West Indies. He died in 1847 at Whitby and was buried at nearby Sneaton. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. If you found it interesting, please click like and subscribe on YouTube. And you can also now download this as an audio podcast on Acast or Spotify. There are links to all 3 in the blurb. Huge and sincere thanks as always to the volunteers who do such a fantastic job with the readings. Next time, we'll be moving on to a 3-part series looking at a brigade of light cavalry at Waterloo. Until then, many thanks for listening.